I'm going to be digging a little bit deep into custom directives today. We have 40 minutes. I'd like to start by asking a couple of questions. First of all, can I get by a show of hands, if you've written a custom directive, would you raise your hand? Wow! The world's authority on directive authorship is in this room right now. Let's hope the big Wasatch earthquake doesn't happen. All right. So my name's Dave. I work for HireVue. I'm on the front-end team. There are 5 of us. We started using Angular in November of 2012. We had a unique opportunity to rewrite pretty much our entire web-based UI, which is it was a great opportunity. We almost went with Backbone, but it was good. The scandal. When we first started, I wanted to use Angular at arm's reach. I wanted to make sure that we didn't get too married to it because, this thing's kind of crazy and weird, and I'm not sure my markup will validate anymore. And so we didn't do things like write custom services or directives at first. But after a few weeks of using it, one of my coworkers came to me and said, check this out. I can write this little directive thing here and plunk it into the app all over the place, and it'll look and behave the same. And I was like, that's really cool. Since then, we've written 146 directives, which means we're just a little bit cooler than DoubleClick, right? just a little bit. So, got some links you can check out later. First, I'd like to start with a really bad joke. This will be funny if you know something about directives. Well, it might not be funny. And it'll be hilarious at the end of the talk. So just, if it's not funny now, don't worry. So what did the directive say after getting cut out of its parents' will? I'm isolated. Get it? Doesn't inherit from the parents. Okay. So yeah, now it's coming, right? Okay. Yeah. Took a little explaining. It'll be even funnier later, I think. So a couple of terms I hope you're comfortable with. Based on what we've heard so far, I think everyone should be. So first of all, Angular has a lot of built-in directives. Here's just a list. You'll see these all over the place. I think a lot of times people use Angular and don't realize when they write ng-repeat, they're actually invoking a directive whose code they could go read. But I'd like to talk a little bit about naming. So let's say you're going to write your own. First of all, I have some principles that my team has adopted that we found useful. The first one is to use a unique prefix for all your directives to avoid clashing with other people's. I don't think non-Angular directives should use the ng prefix generally because to me that denotes that it's an internal prefix. But it can be confusing to read someone's directive that doesn't have a prefix at all, and you find yourself wondering, is this just HTML attribute that I don't know about yet, or is it a directive? And it's nice to know the difference. 2 letters is pretty common. I've seen the Angular UI team uses UI. At HireVue, we use HV for everything. For this talk, I'll use my dash for all the prefixes, just so that it'll be obvious. So if you use a 2-letter prefix with letters and numbers, that's 1,296 prefixes, which ought to be enough for anyone, right? 640K. Let's look at some code from Angular. This is a directive that I think everyone has used. Raise your hand if you've used this. No, raise your hand if you haven't used ng-show. Okay, there's like 1, 2, 3, good, right? But by and large, most people will use this when they start using Angular. Here's what it looks like in the code. It's a very simple directive. It does use animation. We won't talk about that right now. But all it does is return a function that watches an attribute that you give it, and anytime that attribute becomes truthy, it removes a class from the element called ng-hide, and whenever it becomes falsy, it adds an element called ng-hide. And it's that simple. And then there's a CSS rule, of course, that will cause ng-hide to not display. Notice, though, the naming here. When you name a directive in JavaScript, you use camel case, ng, capital S, show. But in HTML, you use it with a hyphen. So that's normalized names for directives in the JavaScript. Just keep that in mind as you look at the code here. Here's a more complicated one. Directives can get pretty complicated, though I recommend avoiding that. But here's the ng class. Has anyone used ng class before? This is a simple directive that you use to specify class names that you would like at runtime to be added and removed to an element. And the code here is, I've actually stripped it down to be a little bit more readable, but the idea here is you just watch an attribute, observe the class value, and you fill in the classes whenever that attribute changes based on what it tells you to do. The attribute that you give to ng class can return an array of classes that it should have, or return an object that points to classes and whatnot. But anyway, so just wanted to point this out. These are all available in the Angular source code, and they're pretty approachable. So I recommend that when you want to see how directives work, a great way to go is read the Angular code. So when do we use them? There are 2 or 3 main places where you want to use a directive. The first one, and my personal favorite, is to create HTML components. In the future, this will be baked into browsers in the form of web components. But for now, Angular gives us this, and you can make your own custom tags. An example would be my widget. This is where you could plunk down a my widget tag wherever you want, and it'll magically be filled in with other HTML. Another use, the second one here, is for HTML behavior. These are typically attribute directives like ngClick. This is when you want to specify in your HTML that on certain actions you want special code to execute. So in the case of ngClick, you specify an Angular expression that will be executed anytime the user clicks on that element. Really common use case is to wrap up jQuery plugins because maybe you're building an Angular app and it's awesome, but you are like, how do I bring in my jQuery plugins? The answer is always, almost always, to use an Angular directive that you write or that's available. Many, many Angular libraries exist out on the web that you can find. UIDate is an example of one from the Angular UI team that I personally have used several times. And the bottom line is anytime you want to interact with the DOM from your JavaScript code, that's when a directive is called for. It's typically bad practice in Angular to interact with the DOM anywhere else. In a controller, in a service, it's bad. And the reason it's bad is because it makes your code less testable and more coupled to the DOM. So let's write one. First things first, I recommend whenever you write a custom directive, you put it inside of its own module. Don't just add it to your application module, but create a new module, which you can see here our first line is doing. And the way you know we're creating a module instead of referencing an existing one is based on the empty array brackets up there. So here we're going to create one called My Directives. Oh, and the reason you do that is to make your directives independently unit testable from the rest of your application so that you can test your directives without loading your whole app. When you then want to use your directives, you have to add your directives module name to your application module, or else they won't be available in the markup and Angular won't know they exist when it encounters them in the DOM. This is a common one to overlook. Anytime you bring in a third-party directive that you may be found on the web, you have to go add it to your application module, the name of its module, the directives module, or else Angular will just not know what it is when it encounters it in the DOM. Okay, and then you register your directive by getting a reference to your module and then just saying directive, and you get a function, and we'll fill that in later. In this case, you could use it by throwing it in the HTML on a div, for example, with my directive. And notice again the naming conventions, my hyphen directive in the HTML and my capital D directive in the JavaScript. So let's create one that actually does something. So one of the cool little feature, you could make a text box, a behavioral directive to extend a text box behavior, would be to make it so that if you have a text box with text in it and the user clicks in that box, you want to automatically select all the text. This is kind of like how your browser address bar works, right? You click in it and it does an auto-select of the whole thing. So if I wanted to do that, creating a directive called select all on focus, oh, notice I forgot the my prefix, that was my mistake. I would do that like this. I would get my module directives, I would declare my directive with the directive function, and I would return an object that describes my directive. We'll talk a little bit about that restrict property in a few minutes, but in this case, the important function is the link function. This function will be called on your directive by Angular when it encounters your directive in the DOM. And what we're going to do, and it'll call it once per directive instance in the DOM. What we're going to do in this case is we're going to catch the mouse up event, and we're going to tell it to prevent default so that the text doesn't get unhighlighted. And then anytime it gets focused, we're going to say element.select, which will cause all the text in the text box to automatically select. And it's just that simple. So previous to Angular directives, you would have had to write jQuery selectors, say, to locate all the boxes that you want to have this behavior and tell it to do this behavior. Excuse me. But with Angular, all you got to do is throw that on any box you want to behave this way. It's super simple, just like that. Note also that the link function takes arguments that are not dependency injected. That's important to keep note of. It takes 4 arguments in order. They're positional. We'll talk about the other 2 later, but in this case, we just wanted the element object, which is actually wrapped up as a jQuery object, if you have jQuery on your page, or a JQLite object if you don't, but it has many of the jQuery features. In this case, we did. Okay. There we go. So a little pop quiz then. In this case, we have 2 input boxes, one with that's called name, one called age, and they both have our new directive called select all on focus. So just pop quiz for the group. How many times will my directive's link function be called? Just hold it up with your hand. Very good. Excellent. 2 times. That's because it encountered it once. What about the directive function back here? this guy up here, how many times will that be called? 1, yeah, excellent. It's one time, just one time only on application load. And bonus points if you're a directive expert, how many times will the compile function of this directive be called that I haven't written? I'm seeing 1s and 2s. Okay, we'll come back to that later. Let's just hold on to that one. I told you I'd come back to the restrict thing. Let's talk about that. So one of the properties your directive can specify when it's registered is how you want it to be usable in the markup. In this case, we've used just the letter A, and that stands for attribute. In this case, it means we are only allowing our directive to exist on an element's attribute. So you can see here div with a myDirective attribute is how you use that. The other common usage is to use the letter E, which means I want this directive to be a custom element or tag name. And you would use it like I show there. There are a couple of other ways to do this that are less utilized. You can use C for classes, so that you could have a directive execute any time it encounters a class, and M for comments. No comment on when you would do that, but it is possible. Not sure if it will still be possible, but it is at least now. Let's do a widget now. So the last one we did was behavioral. Now we're going to do a widget. This is like a custom component. So let's say you have a block of little social sharing buttons on your page that you want to be able to put out, at any given point on the page. You don't want to have to copy and paste these 4 or 5 lines of code everywhere they get used, of course. So instead, we create a little My Social Buttons directive. We want it to expand to what's down there below, which is just a simple div, 3 links with a couple of font awesome icons in them, and they're clickable, and the hrefs go to X, Y, and Z. Nothing special there. Those are just placeholders for actual URLs. Let's see how we do that. So first of all, we register our directive using our camel case naming convention, My Social Buttons. We return an object with properties for restrict of E, because we only want it to be usable as an element. And in this case, we're going to actually have an inline JavaScript string that describes the HTML template that we want that directive to expand to. So this is very simple, a very, very simple custom directive. But the concept that's introduced here is templates. You can type your HTML right into your JavaScript if you want. You could even put curly brace expressions inside this HTML, and they'll be expanded and bound. You can also specify a template URL and ask Angular to go fetch the template code from the server. It will do that exactly once per directive and cache it using the HTTP template cache using the template cache object when it does the http.get. So just like that. And this is actually the way I prefer it. And we've actually gone with most of our directives one step further, and we've done an optimization so that all of the directive HTML loads in the root page in script tags with an ID that's equal to the URL where they could be found. And doing that causes Angular to go find it there instead of having to go back to the server to get it. Which is, there are trade-offs there, but if you want there to be no round-trip costs when every new directive gets encountered by Angular, that's the way to get around that. Okay, so now let's do an interactive widget. So let's say we want a common pattern for a search box that we can put on our app, but it'll be searching different things when we use it in different places. So in this case, we're just going to make an element directive called mySearchBox. It will expose an API via its HTML attributes, and you specify those right there with HTML attributes. In this case, we've called one search text so that you can know what set text the user typed in. And the other is called placeholder, which will let you specify to the directive what placeholder text you want it to use. And then we want it to look like this to expand to that in the browser. So how do we do that? Let's take a look. So first step, we register our search box using the mySearchBox camel case naming convention. We restrict it to elements only with the E. And now we're introducing a new property you can specify for your directives called scope. This gives your directive its own unique scope that's independent from the scope in which the directive exists. And in this case, we're saying there are 3 properties in this scope: search text, placeholder, and used lucky, which we'll talk about in a minute. And this scope is isolated. And it's isolated in the way we talked about earlier, meaning it will not inherit from its parent's will or parent scope. And the way this works in this case is we've specified our HTML here in the template, and we've even given it some ng-click stuff. So this demonstrates that you can nest Angular directives within each other. And we'll show you how that works here in just a second. Other thing to point out here is this search text name is camel cased, but in the HTML, it's hyphen delimited. It's the same name normalization from your HTML attributes as into your JavaScript as is for the Angular names. So in this case, also we've used an equal sign binding here, an @ sign binding here, and another equal sign. I'll go into detail on what those are. When you isolate scope in a directive, you can specify these parameters, and they serve as the API for the scope to talk, or sorry, for the directive to speak to the outside world. You can also, if you just want to isolate the scope of your directive but not actually have an API, you can just say scope true. It's really important to remember, though, that doing this causes your directive to not inherit the scope properties from the enclosing scope. That's important because that actually creates a nicely designed component that is independent of where you put it on your page. That's important for a lot of reasons. The first one being that it creates a clean interface between the directive and the caller. It's a contract. It prevents the directive from reaching outside of its bounds and messing with scope outside, which means you can more safely use third-party directives or your peers' directives without worrying that they're going to reach out and mess with your own scope. It encourages reuse because it has a clean contract, and it discourages guilty knowledge of context in the directive, which also encourages reuse. And the real beauty of this is that it makes it totally testable in isolation because I can instantiate this directive in a unit test without having to worry about the enclosing environment at all. So the parameters. Note we use that equal sign and that @ sign. There are three options here. The equal sign means I would like to have a parameter that is bound to an outside parameter that the caller can specify. In this case, we said search text in our directive we're working on. And what that means is that anytime the directive changes the search text scope variable, the outside caller's variable, whatever they named it, will also change to match. And if the outside caller makes a change, likewise, the directive's property will also change. So very useful for communicating between your directive and an outside caller who you don't know about. Two-way binding. Sometimes I call this a reference binding because effectively what you're doing is creating a reference to the same value. The other method is to use an @ sign, and I like to call this top-down binding. It's not even really binding, but the idea here is that the caller can specify a string that has interpolatable values inside of it. You see an example down here with param2. This is so that the caller can use its scope variables to pass a string that has dynamic bits in it into the directive, and the directive can display that on the screen. Great for placeholder text, like we were just going to use. And the third way is to use the ampersand, and this is so that the directive can do bottom-up communication out to the enclosing environment. The idea here being like ngClick, for example. The directive ngClick knows nothing about your code, but you can give it an expression that will execute, that ngClick will execute for you whenever a click event happens. And that code that it runs will run in the context of your scope. So again, the directive itself does not have to know anything about it. So by reference for equal sign, top down with @ sign, bottom up with the ampersand. That's how I like to remember it. So now let's finish it up. So now we're going to look at the code for that search box. We did create a scope with equal sign binding on the search text. That way, whenever the user types, we can immediately know what the value is outside of the directive. Placeholder text so that callers can give us text, maybe with dynamic bits, maybe not, as a string. And then the used lucky parameter will tell us if they clicked the used lucky button to initiate the search. So how does this work? We have a link function. I took out the template just for brevity. The link function is going to set up two new properties on the scope that are going to be those callback functions that we referenced here just a minute ago, like our ng model, our two ng clicks here, search clicked and lucky click. Those are just on the buttons. And when those get clicked, we're just going to copy whatever the user's search text was into the search text for the outside person to see. And the reason we do that is just so that they don't get every keystroke. They just get it when the user actually says, I want to do a search. And then we set used lucky equals false or true, depending on which way they clicked. So that's it. Now we have a search box that will render HTML to the page consistently anytime you use it. It has behavior associated with that same directive. And outsiders have a nice clean contract that they can use whenever they want to communicate with it. Just like that. OK, so using a scope property is not the only way to pass data into your directive. The other way is to use HTML attributes. And the way you do that is using the attrs, that's how I pronounce it, object that is the third argument to every directive's link function. You can pull string values out. Angular will normalize all the names of your HTML attributes, and then you can pull string values out of those and store them however you like. You can see an example here. We've got a controller, and I want to create a myDirective instance and pass it in some data. The way I do that in this case is I've got this expression. I've actually put a JSON object literal, well, a JavaScript object literal into my directives attribute. And then the directive itself can pull that value out using this adders.myDirective and then evaluate it using the scope. So what this options object will end up being is this actual JavaScript object with some variable evaluated at the time that the link function ran from the enclosing scope. Now the directive itself doesn't know anything about some variable. That was passed in by the caller. And then in this case, it'll end up being foo with a value of 1 and bar with a value of 42. So this can be a little confusing, so I think it's worth going over again. But the scope here is actually the scope from the enclosing environment. Not the directive in this case does not have its own scope. So it knows how to use that scope to evaluate any expression you give it as an attribute value. So why would you want to do this? First of all, also you can notice when these values change by using adders.observe and .set to change them and to be notified of them. And the reason you would want to do this is because it's not a watch on the scope. It's a little faster. It's independent of the digest loop completely. So if you want to pass in data this way and you actually call set on it and change the attributes, the directive will be notified, but it doesn't have to watch scope variables and do dirty checking or anything like that. So, the other reason is if you don't want to introduce a new scope, that by creating the scope property, then you can do it this way and pass in just as rich a set of data as you could from passing in a scope property. Okay, the next concept I want to talk about is compiling. Compiling and linking. At first when I saw these terms, I was like, why are we compiling and linking? And I come from a C++ background, and so to me, compiling is where you take your source code, compile it into an object file, and linking is when you take a bunch of object files and link it into a final executable. This is similar, but it's a little bit different. To introduce it, I think it's best to consider what other tools do, like Handlebars. Here's a Handlebars example. When Handlebars gets a template string, it compiles it. And what it returns is actually a function that you can call with context. And what that returns is a rendered HTML string. In this case, the Angular's compile and link is actually very similar, except instead of operating on strings and returning strings, it operates DOM and manipulates DOM as the output. So a compile function takes an element and returns a link function, which you can then call with and pass it a scope. And then the scope, it'll use the scope to evaluate what the current context should be and render the DOM directly to the browser using that scope. So how do I know if I need to use a compile function in my directive or not? So take a look at some of these directives that come with Angular: ngRepeat, ngIf, and ngSwitch. And the reason you need a compile function is when your directive needs to make DOM changes, like by pulling things out of the DOM, putting them into the DOM, after link time. So like if you want, and this is exactly what ngRepeat does. Think about it. If I've got an array of 3 elements and I've got an ngRepeat watching that array, if I add a 4th element to the array, what's it got to do? Well, it's got to go back to the original source template and relink it again, except this time with that new 4th object as its scope. And what if I pull an element out of the array? Same thing. It's got to pull that element out of the DOM. And so that's why it needs to hang on to the compiled result of the original source template for ngRepeat, so that later it can reapply it as it adds and removes elements. Same thing is true of ngSwitch, because it actually removes elements from the DOM depending on which ngSwitch case is currently active. So generally speaking, whenever you need to reuse your source HTML template multiple times, that's when you need a compile step in your directive. Of all the 146 directives that we've written, but who's counting? Just want to be a little more awesome than anyone else. We don't actually, I've only written compile on maybe 2 or 3 of them. By and large, directives don't need this unless you're doing kind of advanced DOM manipulation. But let's do an example. So in our application, we started to notice that as we added more and more directives, our pages started to get a little slower. And what we realized was that there's a lot of hidden features on our page that were still being loaded at load time, but weren't necessarily being used until a user, say, clicks a button. So take, for example, a big complicated form that you've got on your page, and the user clicks a button to reveal that form and fill it out and then hit save. you don't need to pay the penalty for loading that whole form and processing any directives inside that form and all the watch expressions and everything in that form at load time necessarily. You need to take that penalty when the user actually opens the form and it needs to be used. And if you have 10 such forms in your app and none of them are actually being used at the moment, it would be awfully wasteful to load all 10 eagerly at page load time. That was influencing our performance pretty badly. So we created a directive called lazy load. And the idea here is if you've got an expensive block of DOM, you can put the HV, in our case HV, but in this case my lazy load, on that DOM element, wrap a div around it, and then what it will do is when ready to show, in this case, becomes truthy, it will load that DOM in and then stop watching and just do nothing anymore. That's the idea. But until then, it will prevent any subsequent nested directives from running, any watch expressions from running, and Angular will basically stop processing the DOM below this. Right? Very good for load time. So let's see how that looks. So this is going to introduce a couple of new concepts, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But it actually uses the word transclude, which is, I know, a little intimidating, but we'll get to that too. It has a high priority. This is to make sure that it runs before any other directive on that element. And it's called terminal, and that prevents subsequent directives from being processed. In this case, we're restricting it to attributes because, again, we want to put myLazyLoad as an attribute on another element. And it has a compile function, and that's all it has, no link function. What we're doing in this case is we are keeping track of whether we've been shown yet, and we're doing a watch on the caller's scope with whatever value they passed in to here, ready to show. In this case, they passed ready to show. When that becomes truthy and this watch function gets called, and we haven't been shown, we're going to set has been shown to true. We're going to link in, now we're calling that linker function, all of the DOM below us with the scope from the enclosing environment. And then we're going to unwatch. And this is where the directive backs off and says, I'm not going to be a watcher anymore. I'm out. My job is done here. So it's adding one watcher to Angular until it becomes truthy, and then it's out. Just like that. This saved us a lot of page load time in our app, doing this kind of thing. So you might say, how is this different from ngIf? And the answer is, it's almost exactly the same as ngIf, except for when ngIf, that expression becomes falsy, it actually removes the DOM again from the browser. And when it becomes truthy, it puts it back in, relinks it again, and again, falsy comes out. This one only adds DOM and then bails and never watches again. So it's really great for high-cost startup stuff. So that's an example of when you would use compile. Oh, and just a note, the priority property did change in Angular 1.2. So if you haven't already upgraded, the scheme there changed a little bit. Okay, everyone's favorite subject. So by show of hands, who feels confident today that if asked upon, they could explain transclusion successfully to another developer? You know, I'd say that's 5 to 10%. Is that about right? Sound good? I felt the same way you did until like 3 hours ago. No, just kidding. Actually, the same coworker that came to me and said, Dave, we need to do directives, came to me and said, Dave, I'd like to tell you what transclusion is because I'm pretty sure based on what you're saying that you have no idea what you're talking about. Thank you very much. And he explained it to me and I was like, that's too simple. That can't be right. I'm not going to say that out loud. And so like 6 months later, I said it out loud, and other people were like, yeah, that's it. So it took a while to build up my confidence. But I like to think of transclusion as a picture frame. Imagine, if you will, if I'm a manufacturer of picture frames, and I sell them to the public, but I always put my own pictures in them. Right? Kind of a crappy picture frame manufacturer idea. But that is what a directive would be without transclusion. You can use my directive, but I'm bringing my content. You can't put your own inside. A transcluded directive is one that frames some HTML and allows the caller to specify the content of that HTML. So a transcluded directive is like a picture frame. So let's see an example of that. Let's say we want to create a dialog on the page where the dialog has a header and a footer that's common and consistent throughout your application, but each developer that uses your dialog directive brings their own content and fills it in. Okay? Again, a dialog that doesn't allow you to specify the content would be a pretty crappy dialog, just like a crappy picture frame. So in this case, we've created a dialog. We've restricted it to, or a directive called myDialog. We've restricted it to element only, so it's just for custom tags. We've said transclude true, And we've created a little HTML template. In this case, we've done div class equals modal, just to give it a modal class, with a nested div class equals modal body. And then look in green, ng transclude. That attribute is how Angular finds the content that the caller specified and inserts it below that element as a child of it. Not below it, but as a child of it. Okay, so I just want to talk through that again because it's kind of weird. But this is how the directive author says picture frame content goes here, right where I've marked ng transclude. You could have as much HTML as you want in here, and then a single ng transclude, and Angular will put the caller's content in there. So sometimes it's useful to see this in reverse order, but here's how you would use it. I've got a myDialog directive, my own custom tag, and then I bring my own content. I've got some custom title, some custom dialog content goes here, whatever I want. This is up to the caller to bring their own content. That h1 and that p element will be put into the ng transclude place there as a child of that div. Okay, so bring your own content, just like that. So in this case, it expands into div class equals modal, div class equals modal body. That came from the directive. Then h1 and a p tag that came from the caller. So picture frame. So just by a show of hands, how many people would feel more comfortable now explaining what transclusion is to their developer than 5 minutes ago? Okay, 50%, not bad. We'll have office hours afterward for the rest of you. But don't hate yourself. It's a hard concept, and it's very abstract. When I read it for the first time, I thought, Mishko made this word up. Then I went to Wikipedia and saw, that's a thing. Then I checked the edit history just to make sure that it wasn't all Google, and it's not. So it's legit. This is a real computer science term. There are several that do transclusion. Think about it. ng repeat. What good would an ng repeat block be if you couldn't specify your own content for each repeated block? It's transcluded. ng switch, same thing. You bring your own content and you specify the ng switch cases. What good would it be if you couldn't bring your own content? And ngIf, same story. All right, so this is all the stuff we didn't talk about that I'd be happy to talk about some more. But directives there's a lot more to them. There are some strange behaviors that you might not expect when you put two directives on the same element. There are rules about when that's allowed and when that's not. And along those same lines, directives are kind of the thing that drives scope throughout your Angular application, throughout the whole DOM. Scope is coupled to elements in the DOM, and directives are what make that possible. We didn't talk about what it means to do transclude element. We can talk about that later if you want. And one last thing that we didn't talk about that I think is really cool, and I'll just take the last minute to talk about this. Standard HTML attributes can be directives too. So if I've got IE8 and it does not honor the placeholder attribute on input text boxes, I'm kind of screwed, right? This is why the jQuery placeholder plugin exists, right, to fill in this gap. What if I wrote a directive that was an attribute directive that was just called placeholder, and all it does is detect if it's IE8, and if it is, it calls jQuery.placeholder on the element, just like that. So imagine how powerful it is to be able to do behavioral extensions of your HTML to fill in holes for older browsers and to give your application consistent behavior and look and feel easily and repeatably and without repeating yourself. So thanks very much.